This video was supported by an educational grant from HealthMark.
Hi, I'm Christina Hopkins. My work is in environmental health and infectious disease, and I'm the research manager at Ofstead Associates, which is a company that specializes in conducting real-world research in order to improve patient safety and occupational health. Now, I'm here today to talk about making resource requests using the SBAR model to get what you need. Guidelines and standards are changing all the time, and these shifts often require additional equipment and training for personnel who are expected to implement new practices like using different PPE or beginning to use tools in the sterile processing department to test things like water quality, inspect instruments, or perform tests to verify cleaning effectiveness. So, how do you go about asking for what your department needs, knowing that budgets are tight and free time is non-existent? Many managers use the SBAR model for these situations because it helps them organize their thoughts in a concise and easily glanceable way that many decision makers are familiar with. So what's SBAR stand for? Let's break it down. First, the S stands for situation. You start with a concise statement describing the situation or problem, with background, or B, coming up next, which provides pertinent information about the factors that brought the situation to the forefront. Then there's A, or assessment, which provides information or data that illustrates the challenges and the need for solutions in your department or facility, along with your interpretation of that data. And finally, we have the R, or the recommendations, for solutions and the resources you think are necessary to address the situation successfully. Now, folks in the field tell us that they try to keep SBARs under a page with attachments, like this one on getting tools for visual inspection. This SBAR is actually available to download as a customizable document from the link in the video description. And obviously, you can develop SBARs for other needs too. So before you start writing an SBAR, think about two things. Number one, who your audience is. And number two, what do they want or need to hear from you when you're asking for resources? In many cases, decision makers don't have a lot of free time, so ask them what you can do to make things easy for them, and then use that to tailor your SBAR to their preferences. Let's consider an example of how the SBAR model might be used. Many SBARs stem from the need to either address a complaint or address a new guideline. For example, say the OR is complaining about dirtier reader scopes making their way to the OR, and they're mad at SPD for sending up damaged and dirty scopes. Like this one, which was supposed to be patient-ready, but had some schmutz clearly visible on the biopsy port. Multiple incidents like this contributed to the situation that sparked this SBAR. The background section of your SBAR gives you an opportunity to provide some context for your decision makers. Summarizing relevant manufacturer, IFU, or customer letters is a great starting point. And consider what other kinds of supporting documentation may also be persuasive to your leadership. Things like brief excerpts from guidelines and standards, government safety communications, especially things like recalls, FDA adverse event reports, or peer-reviewed literature. Now, if you aren't familiar with the FDA's adverse event database, it includes problems with medical devices that have been reported by manufacturers and end users. It could be helpful in supporting your request for quality improvement resources by illustrating what can go wrong. Like this one, which describes a patient being injured by a damaged gastroscope, which might have looked something like this. Yikes, nobody wants whiskers on scopes. Photos can make another impactful addition to the background section of your SBAR. In our papers and webinars, we've published lots of photos of scopes that are damaged or dirty or have other kinds of issues, despite being patient-ready. These kinds of research findings are what drove guidelines to strengthen their visual inspection recommendations. You could always add a few of these as an attachment to show your decision makers what others have found with visual inspection. Now, if you're baffled about how to get started with all of this, we've actually put together some resources that will help you launch quality initiatives, especially when it comes to processing endoscopes. They're available for free on our webinar portal, linked in the video description. Make sure to check out a worksheet that we developed to map out how much time processing actually takes, the customizable SBAR template for setup for visual inspection that I showed at the top of the deck, a crosswalk of evidence that supports quality initiatives like doing visual inspection, cleaning, verification, etc., and finally, links to our open access research articles on a variety of infection control topics. And if you're not familiar, open access means that they're free to download for anybody, so check those out for sure. Now, while you're on the portal, make sure to check out our webinars too. These are a tremendous resource on quality management with endoscopes, and they include tons of pictures, reference lists, and charts that summarize the evidence that you could use in the background section of your SBAR. Okay, so let's move on to the assessment section, and this is where you describe the current state of your facility's setup and practices, and really importantly, the gap between what you're doing and what's recommended. This can help you identify potential solutions to address the situation. So how do you assess your current practices? Well, start by looking at your institutional policies and your training materials, if they exist. Review any log sheets and documentation on things like repairs, maintenance, complaints, and competencies. And finally, get down to the department. Observe practices and take pictures of anything that might illustrate factors that contributed to the situation. Your assessment should provide some context for your recommendations. And finally, the recommendations section. Before you start composing your recommendations, think about what kinds of resources you need. These may fall into two buckets. The first kind might be relatively straightforward stuff, things like acquisition of materials and space. Consider whether you're asking for a one-time cost, like a borescope, or if there are going to be ongoing expenses for consumable materials, like what you might encounter if you started doing cleaning verification tests. And finally, think about what capital limits are in place for major purchases and how that applies to the equipment that you need. The second bucket covers what you may need to actually use any new equipment or supplies or make other changes in practices. We've heard from so many sites that they got the borescopes, and then the borescopes lived in the case for 6 months while they figured out what to do with them. Don't let that be you. The things that we're talking about now are implementation costs, and they're not always strictly monetary. These might include time for training or competency testing, like this training session we held on visual inspection last year. It could also include additional personnel or staff time for performing inspections, providing supervision, or responding to findings, things like packaging up scopes for repair or re-cleaning them. And finally, you might need support from other departments. And thinking through these things ahead of time will help you put together a clear resource request that will hopefully get you what you need to be successful when taking steps to improve quality and safety. Now, when you're actually ready to write your recommendations section, there are a couple different ways to structure your recommendations based on your decision maker's preferences. The overarching vision here is to inspect every scope every time, right? So one approach could be to provide several broad options to your decision makers. Now, ideally, you'd be able to get equipment, including magnifying glasses and borescopes, and training to all staff who might perform visual inspection. So that would be the first choice, right? But while guidelines suggest considering borescope use, they aren't required by guidelines. So a more cost-effective option to meet the minimum requirement might be buying magnification glasses and training the endo personnel just on those. And finally, maybe there's an option that maximizes your existing resources without having to buy new equipment. Something like sending scopes to a centralized unit that's already using these tools and has the training to do so. And giving options like these to your decision makers gives them more opportunities to find something to say yes to, and gives you fallback options in case the first recommendation doesn't work out. Now, the previous approach didn't include any specific numbers, but broadly speaking, budget is a key consideration regardless of what your SBAR is about. First, consider whether there might be an option that doesn't require any budget at all. Maybe it's centralization, or maybe it's sharing resources with another department. Also, explore alternative potential funding sources. Your institution might cover it, but there might also be grants or foundations that could provide funds. And finally, maybe your decision makers want to see all of the potential costs, be them capital or operational, or in support of acquisition or implementation. If your audience wants that, the nitty-gritty details, you can break them down like we did in our visual inspection SBAR template. Now note, we didn't include a comprehensive list of factors, so make sure you really think everything through, and then first break down costs for factors like the cost of the equipment and associated hardware or consumables. You can get some of that information from vendors or work with your biomed and purchasing departments. Also, consider the time needed to perform inspection and how that'll add up to total staff time increases. You can estimate time yourself using a stopwatch and observing practices, or you can look at published research that breaks it down. Being thorough can help avoid snafus down the road. We hope that this introduction to SBAR is useful to you in your quest to improve quality at your institution. We walked through a visual inspection case study during this video, but the same approach can be used for anything: PPE, cleaning verification, etc. Just make sure that whatever you request, you keep your SBAR concise, specific, and actionable. Now, just a reminder that the customizable template for visual inspection SBAR is available on our webinar portal, and if you're interested in using it to bolster your visual inspection practices or other quality management processes, I'd recommend checking out our YouTube videos and our webinars for great visuals, explanations of current evidence, and reference lists. All of these are linked in the video description. For more information, visit our website or contact us by email at education@ofstedinsights.com. This webinar was supported by an educational grant from Healthmark. Healthmark provided our team with financial support and clinical insights related to the development of this video. Please contact Healthmark directly for information about their products and educational services at www.hmark.com. And finally, here's a list of disclaimers that you should read before making any changes to policies or practices at your facility.